Farhan, the Edmonton Elks were 0-8 on the season and near the bottom of virtually every meaningful offensive statistic when they turned to Tre Ford at quarterback. He gave them a good effort against Winnipeg, and they've won the next two games. A lot of fans wondering, why did it take the Elks and Chris Jones so long to get to Tre Ford?
Dave, it's a fair question, but I've also heard the suggestion that Tre Ford should have been the opening day starter for the Elks, which to me is a little ridiculous because here's a guy that had just 2 professional starts a year ago. He got injured in the second one, so that led to some durability questions. And then prior to that, in the previous 2 seasons, because of the pandemic, he'd played in just 7 U Sports games. So to suggest that with that body of work, he should be given the keys to the car at the front end of the season doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And also consider that Tre Ford was number 3 coming into this year, not just number 2. Now, the bigger question is the fact that Taylor Cornelius was given a $100,000 guarantee in his contract for subsequent seasons. Why did that happen based on his previous body of work? Because that forced the Elks to go with him longer to just make 100% sure that they knew what they had. They probably should have made the change to their number 2 quarterback so they could eventually get to Tre Ford sooner.
Yeah, that guarantee may have bought Taylor Cornelius some more time, but one of the other things that the Elks staff goes by is they're big on analytics in practice. They grade every throw, and Tre Ford was consistently 3rd among their quarterbacks. They're looking at things like completion percentage in practice, throws on body, those kinds of things. But one of the things that Chris Jones acknowledges is that Tre Ford, because of his unique skill set, his athleticism, his ability to run with the ball, to throw on the run, some of the things he can do very aggressively in games are tough to simulate in practice. There are just certain scenarios where he'll do things in games that you would not see a player do in practice. So he falls into the category of one of those quarterbacks that is tough to evaluate just off of practice. The gap between what he can do in games and practice is significant. That's something I think the Elks acknowledge and are willing to live with right now as they've seen what he's done during the first 3 starts he's made this season.
Yeah, now the thing that's tough to live with and tough to hear is the fact the Elks turned against Tre Ford for some reason because he was Canadian. Like, that is ridiculous because you look at Chris Jones, he was the highest ranking senior executive of any CFL team to attend the Buffalo Pro Day last year where Tre Ford really stood out. And then he was the only guy to draft him in the first round. And I'll tell you this, I don't know that any other CFL team would have even drafted Tre Ford in the top 2 rounds. So he showed some faith in Tre Ford then. On top of that, those metrics and how he was graded in training camp this year, well, a year ago, he graded Tre Ford much higher. In fact, he was just a hair behind the opening day starter, Nick Arbuckle. So if being Canadian wasn't a problem a year ago, why was it a problem now? So for anybody who suggests that the reason Tre Ford didn't get an opportunity this year because he was Canadian, think again.
Well, Tre Ford was certainly Canadian a year ago when Chris Jones was at that University of Buffalo Pro Day, after which he told me he walked out of there and phoned Jarius Jackson, their quarterback coach and now offensive coordinator, and said, go to school on Tre Ford. I've just watched his workout. He's a draftable player. And, of course, they did take him in the first round and gave him a start in the first month of the season. Farhan, in 30-plus years of covering the Canadian Football League, I believe that's the earliest start a quarterback coming out of U Sport has ever received from a CFL team. So if Chris Jones is anti-Canadian, that's a strange way to show it. He also, of course, had Brandon Bridge play for him when he was in Saskatchewan. But right now it is Tre Ford the rest of the way under center for the Elks as they look to get back into this playoff race.